Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning. It's good to have everyone here this morning. Good to be here. I don't have a lot of introduction for this chapter because I want to get right into the lesson itself and hopefully not make this a really long lesson because there's a lot of things that are very familiar about this lesson. We see miracles. We see resistance against the teachings of the kingdom in the form of John the Baptist being beheaded. So let's get into what the chapter is going to look like. We have some more hostile responses to the kingdom there, like I said. Herod Antipas is the main culprit here. He has a birthday party, and some various different things go down there. And after that, Jesus says in chapter 14 and verse 13, now when Jesus heard, he withdrew from there. This is not the first time that we've seen Jesus try to withdraw. He tries to withdraw himself previously when he's on a mountain already. And he tries to go to this wilderness area that is on a mountain. Now, this is on the other side of the lake, on the western side of the lake, that he's tried to do this in chapters 5, right? Remember? Sermon on the Mount, right? He's trying to withdraw to go to those areas. And then at the end of chapter 7, he tries to leave and go somewhere else, and they follow him again. So this is not the first time that Jesus has withdrawn. But he can't get away. When the boat lands, there's already a crowd of people. It says it lands in a wilderness area. There was no reason for those people to be there. There was no reason for those people to be there, but they were there. And we're going to talk about how they got there a little bit later. And then he walks on the water, and he demonstrates something that only the God of Israel can do, or at least that has done in the Hebrew Scriptures. And he heals many people again, like we've seen before. And, I have feeding of the crowd there, but also in that feeding of the crowd, he also heals people. And so this is a constant theme with Jesus, is that he goes around healing people. And so when we come to chapter 14, we see somebody who is associated with Jesus and is closely associated with Jesus. He is Jesus' closest colleague in the kingdom movement, if we want to call it that. And so John's imprisonment happens, if we really want to think about it in today's mindset, it happens at Herod Antipas's house, right? John's imprisonment and execution happened at Antipas's palace in Machaerus in Perea. So Perea is directly east of Jerusalem. It is about 50 miles south of Galilee, southeast. Galilee is generally, I meant to put up the map this morning, but I guess I didn't. Galilee is on the northwest shore of the lake, and Perea is down on the southeast shore of the Salt Sea, the Dead Sea, the Salt Lake. So these two territories are not really connected, right? And Antipas had palaces in both areas, and he built this new city of Tiberias in Galilee, right? And he built it on top of a graveyard, and so none of the Jews wanted to go into the city because they were superstitious about it. And he moved between these two palaces, Tiberias and Machaerus. And so, let me back up. We should probably first talk about how he got to power. We talked about this in class, so if you were here for that, you're going to hear the story again, because it's story time. Herod the Great, the grandpappy Herod, he dies about 4 to 6 BC. We're not sure when. And his children, who were in his will, the ones he hadn't killed, because he had killed 2 of his own children already. The ones who were in the will, the ones he had just changed in the will days before his death, were fighting. Herod Antipas, the guy we're talking about today, was concerned because his dad had told him that he was going to take over everything. Well, turns out days before his death, he's a little bit irritated at Herod Antipas's mother, and so he cuts, you only get a quarter now instead of the whole thing. And so there was some fighting. And so they go to Rome. Antipas and Philip, had the 2 characters in the story that are children of Herod the Great, had both been raised in Rome. And so they knew Rome. They knew the culture there, and they were involved in the politics there. So Herod the Great dies, and his children go to Rome to divide up these lands and provinces. And this was really a genius move by the Romans because the Romans didn't actually have to conquer anything. They didn't ever send any soldiers to that area to conquer it until much later when there was rebellion. Right? They just put this little vassal king in here or a tetrarch over here and never had to do anything. They got paid for it. They got to pay their taxes. It was a great deal for them. And so while Antipas is in Rome, he has this sexual fling with his brother's wife. And they make plans for Herodias to divorce her brother Herod, also named Herod Philip, which was not allowed under the Mosaic law. A woman was not allowed to leave her husband under Mosaic law for those terms. And Antipas was going to divorce his own wife, Phasaelus, who was the daughter of the king of Nabatea, King Aretas. And so it was this very brazen act which provoked eventually a catastrophic war for Antipas between him and his father-in-law. And so John's objection to their marriage of Antipas and Herodias, Philip's wife, had this wide popular support, right, among the more conservative Jewish sects. Not only did the marriage infringe on the Mosaic law of marrying a close relative, because she was technically the half niece of both Philip and Antipas, but it only happened after 2 divorces, one of which the law of Moses didn't permit. And so Antipas's divorce from his first wife, the king of Petra, the king of Nabatea, and Herodias' divorce of Philip were the basis of this relationship. And so when you build a relationship on evil, what can you expect from that relationship? You can expect nothing but human results, evil. And what made it even worse was that Herodias had repudiated her first husband. She didn't even try to divorce him under the Mosaic law because she couldn't. She just said, "I'm leaving," and left. And that was forbidden under Jewish law. And so, but it was allowed under Roman law. And so you can see now how there's this complex dynamic of situations that are going on. Both Philip and Antipas are part Jew because Grandpappy Herod, his wife, was part Jew. And so they try to placate the Jews. Antipas never puts an image, a human image, on any of his coinage so that he doesn't irritate people because, Jews didn't like a representation of a human figure. That was idolatry to them. Antipas builds various prayer houses and synagogues. And so he tries to portray himself as this person who is following the law, who is a good and faithful Jew. But he has this glaring thing that happens, and that is that he takes his brother's wife. And it says here in chapter 14 that she still is. For when Herod had John arrested, he bound him and put him in prison on account of Herodias, the wife of his brother Philip. Matthew tells us that Herodias was Philip's wife, even though she was married to Antipas. So, let's keep going here. So that's the background of Herod. So now we can kind of understand what's going on there. So now we have this royal birthday party going on here, and it's for Antipas, who by this point was calling himself Herod Antipas, right? He wanted to be associated with his father, who was King Herod. And eventually we find out, this is much later in the story, he wants to be king so bad that he goes to Rome to petition to become king, and they say, "What are you thinking?" and kick him out and send him off into exile. That's eventually what happens. So, before that though, Herod, in the lap of luxury and in money and authority and power, is having this lavish birthday party. There's lots of alcohol involved. And this girl who used to be my niece is now my daughter. She comes and she pleases everyone with her dancing. This is not, like I said in class, this is not a Puritan movie. This is something that is sexually suggestive. She pleases, quote unquote, Herod so much that he makes this foolish promise, right, that his new wife is going to take advantage of. And the severed head of John the Baptist is going to be delivered to her because John is bringing shame onto her. Remember, there's an honor shame. The severed head is carried by Salome and is delivered to mom at this drunken birthday party. Natalie said there's no sound. Give me 1 second. One second. Seems like there's sound on my end. Can you try the video, Jeanette, and see if the video link? See if there's sound. Okay, so the bottom line here is that kingdoms of this world are going to rumble on and continue doing what they've always done. If we think that we are somehow exempt from portraying ourselves as part of Herod's birthday party, we really need to reconsider what's going on. Because what's going on here is just a reflection of what we have in this world. There's no audio? No audio. No audio. I'm showing audio on my end, so is it playing for you? Yeah. Okay, so it's working on our end here. It's probably something on your end. We can help you in the future. So let's get back to where we were. We're at this drunken birthday party, and if we think that somehow we are somehow exempt from this, we're deceiving ourselves, because the kingdoms of this world, the fixtures of this world are going to continue always doing what they've always done. And we can see examples of that in our own culture. If we look at the leaders of our own country, right? What are they always about? It's about money, it's about land, it's about power, and it's about sex. And does any of that sound familiar with our own leadership of this country? And so what do we see in our own world? What do we see around us? It's not our own country. Let's look at all the other countries around us. The countries of the Eastern Bloc, that are the Ukraine and all these countries. What do we see there? We see the same thing. Money, power, sex, land. The land grab in Ukraine right now. Good people have horrible things happening to them. Right? Bad people sit in power, and Matthew is giving a portrait of the world as we know it today. And don't think that this is, that's some ancient party. That would never happen to us, right? And right here, it looks like everything Jesus has been working for in the kingdom movement might come crashing down. Herod is now aware of Jesus. He's now on the radar. He thinks that Jesus is John the Baptist reincarnated. I just killed this guy. Now I got to kill him again. So there's three stories that kind of remain in the chapter after this story, and I'm not skipping over John's death by any means, but I want to get ahead, and then I want to come back and tie them all together at the end. So there's three more stories here, and these stories are linked not by their content, but by their geographical locations as part of the same continuing journey, right? And so one involves the multiplication of food, one has the ability to walk on water, and the rest of them at the very end of the chapter are part of physical healings, right? And so the last we heard of Jesus of Nazareth at the end of chapter 13, Jesus leaves Nazareth, though, and now he's in his more normal location of being around the lake of Galilee. And now he's on that northwest shore area. And so his withdrawal here in verse 13 and the sequence of events that follow that are going to mark the end of Jesus' ministry in Galilee, really and truly. He's not going to spend any significant time in Nazareth or Galilee again. And so Jesus is now on the run. The Pharisees have already stated their intentions to kill Jesus in the last chapter, right? Chapter 12, 11 and 12. And now Jesus is on Herod's radar as a resurrected person he just killed. In verse 13, Jesus hears of his cousin/colleague's death, and he has some very real and raw emotions, and he wants to get away. So he tries to get away, but he fails. And when he reaches that desolate place he was looking for, there's already crowds there. How these crowds get there isn't an exercise in futility, because it's not really written for us. But we need to remember he's on the west side of the Jordan River. When he sails, he's then on the east side of the Jordan River in the wilderness, where there's not a city, which means he's miles away from things, because there is no city over there. There's Bethsaida, possibly, but it's not on the shore. It's several miles inland. So how did these thousands of people get there? They either crossed the river, they either took boats, which, I mean, it would have taken an armada of boats to get over there. It's possible, but not likely. Or they ran through the day to try and meet him there. We're getting to something that is very important in the story, and that is these events that Matthew is describing for us are not about what is on the surface, but what is about Matthew is trying to describe to us. What Matthew is trying to describe to us is about what is the whole story and how it fits together, what is under the surface. And so let's look at that. Let's look at how Jesus feeds the crowd here. And the story is another example of Matthew presenting Jesus as the new Moses, right? Can we think of another story where Israelites are hungry, wandering in the wilderness, and their leader miraculously feeds them? Can we think of another story? Maybe. I don't know. The Exodus, right? Right? Under Moses, these large number of people were miraculously fed in the wilderness, right? Moses is unlike Jesus because Moses is not performing the miracle. He doesn't go out there and wave his hands around and then manna falls, right? It's not what happens, right? He's simply a spokesman for God. He describes the manna as the bread that the Lord has given you to eat, Exodus 16 and verse 15. And so this incident, it stands out as a spectacular miracle, and another display of Jesus' great authority over nature and the human condition. But like we studied last week, whenever we see a story that we find familiar to us, that is the point when we need to back up, stop what we're doing, and reevaluate the story. Because when we read something we've read a lot of times we confirm the biases we already have. And so a good way to study the story, and going forward, I would encourage you, if you find a story that you find familiar, like the tradition and the commandments here, why do you teach us the traditions of men as the commandments of God? You know, that's something we've heard a lot maybe, and so we kind of skip over that in our mind. I would encourage you to sit down and write down all the main characters of the story, what is actually happening in each verse, and then reevaluate the story based off that breakdown, not evaluate it based on what you already know about the story. Reevaluate the story like you've never read it before is what I'm trying to say. And so last week when we studied the parables, right, we paid attention to what Matthew actually focused on in the parables, and it wasn't always what we remember about the parables, right? And so only 2 of the 9 verses here, when we're talking about the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000, are about feeding the 5,000, actual feeding going on. So that leaves the bulk of the story as this teaching moment that Jesus is using with the disciples. Because it doesn't tell us that the greater population even noticed the miracle that was going on, right? And so who notices the people's needs here? Well, it says the disciples did, and that's good, right? Good for them for noticing other people instead of just caring about themselves, right? And who actually gives the bread to the people? Well, that's the disciples. They've been following this man for a year and a half, and so they must have noticed that Jesus has this immense well of compassion within himself. Remember, he is mourning the loss of his cousin and closest member of colleague, whatever you want to call him, in the kingdom movement that he's beginning. And so Jesus must have had this immense well of compassion for hurting and broken people. Not only does he feed them, but we often skip over verse 14 at the end, in the 3 little words, he healed their sick. So not only did he feed them, but he healed them also. Jesus is hurting, but he puts that aside to help others, or to at least train his disciples to help others, right? And so here's the point of the story, I think, that we sometimes overlook. It's not the amazing miracle that nobody in the crowd notices, but the point of the story is in Jesus' challenge to his disciples, which is what? What does he say? They don't need to go away. You feed them. Uh-oh. That means I got to do something, right? The disciples, they bring their small ideas, their small concepts of what they think they can do to Jesus, and he turns it all around and he hands it back to them to go do something, except that now this challenge is this monstrous kingdom of God task, right, that they're totally inadequate for. Right? They see themselves and they recognize that they are totally inadequate for feeding these 5,000 people. And what is their reaction? What is our reaction when that happens? Well, I can think of a million different reasons why I'm not qualified to go out and teach people the Bible. I can think of a million reasons why I'm not qualified to counsel somebody who is in a difficult situation. Think of a million reasons why I don't have enough money to go out and do whatever it is that I need to do. I'm not a good speaker. I'm not a good teacher. I'm too old. I'm too young. That's the beauty of the story, is that Jesus takes what we have and he does something miraculous and profound. Have you ever noticed that? Have you noticed that I switched to the present tense there and I was talking about us? What did Jesus do? What did Jesus do? Verse 19. And he ordered the multitudes to recline on the grass. Some of your translations say sit on the grass. But the word there is the same word that's used when they recline at the table, because they didn't have chairs, right? They laid down. This is not just like, sit down on the grass, I'm about to give you something. This is like, take it easy. Just relax. We're gonna get everything. And he ordered the multitudes to recline on the grass, and he took 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking upward to heaven, he blessed the food, and breaking the loaves, he gave it to the disciples, and disciples gave to the multitudes. Jesus takes our offering of next to nothing, of us thinking that we cannot be useful, and he takes it and he holds it up in prayer and says a blessing, or some versions say a prayer, or a blessing to the Father, and he breaks what we bring to him, and he does something amazing here. He gives it to others so that they can be nourished by that gift also. Please notice that it's the disciples that are giving out what they offered through Christ. Christ doesn't make something from nothing. He doesn't, gather up some grass and turn it into bread. He takes what they have already and he breaks it and he gives it to others. And so it looks like the disciples are the ones doing the feeding, right? But Christ is the one who is behind the power. So what does that event remind us of taking the bread, blessing it, breaking it, and giving it to everyone to be nourished on spiritually? Well, it reminds us of, let me just start off the way my notes go. I was going to go down a different road, but let me just go by the notes so I don't get lost. So we've moved, think about this, we've moved from Antipas, Herod Antipas's lavish and degenerate feast to one with a different menu, right? A more simple menu, but also a more wholesome atmosphere, right? And so the significance of Jesus' actions here really become clear when we read all of the gospel accounts of these feeding stories. There's 5 of them. And we find the same sequence of action verbs in those stories. Took, blessed, broke, gave. We also find those same verbs in the 3 accounts of the Last Supper. Took, blessed, gave, broke. Broke, gave. Anyway. So feeding the crowd here, in Matthew's mind, he's clearly trying to telegraph to us, because he knows the end of the story, right? When he's writing this, he knows the end of the story. He's trying to telegraph to us that this is a foretaste of the central act of worship of this newly formed Christian community that Matthew is writing this book to. Matthew isn't writing this book to people before the cross. He's writing this book to people after the cross to show them that this was a foretaste. And the Last Supper itself is a foretaste of the messianic banquet, right? Matthew chapter 26 and verse 29. So the Jews had this idea of at the end there would be this great messianic banquet, and the Messiah would preside over it. Matthew 26 and verse 29. But I say to you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on till the day I drink it with you in my Father's kingdom. There was going to be a day that Jesus would drink that blessing again with them. And that dimension of that final banquet can be seen in this story right here. But we need to transport ourselves back to the story. Where is the story taking place? In the wilderness, with people who are hungry, with people who are hurting. They're coming to Jesus. That's you and me, people who are hurting. We need to come to Jesus so that we can be a part of his kingdom, so we can be a part of that messianic banquet. And Matthew is going to use the language of the Last Supper here as he remembers the story of how Jesus asked them, the disciples, to participate in the kingdom coming, and the kingdom coming into the lives of these people who are hurting and who are sick, who are right there on the shores in the midst of tragedy. I don't know if they're still wet from crawling through the river. There wasn't a bridge over the river at that point. There might have been some sort of boat or something that crossed the Jordan. Now, it wasn't a huge river, and so Matthew is asking Jesus is asking his disciples to participate into the kingdom that is coming into the lives of these people. And so Jesus takes things that seem insignificant, and he breaks it, and he blesses it, and then it becomes a gift to other people. And he did that with his own life, and he did it here in chapter 14 with the next to nothing that the disciples have to offer. And so the disciples in the crowd, you got to think about this, in their situation, they are not thinking Lord's Supper. They're not thinking Messianic banquet, right? What are they thinking? If they knew it was a miracle at all, which, I'm guessing that some of them would have guessed feeding 5,000 people. You don't just carry 5,000 people worth of bread around, right? They might have thought about Elisha, right? 2 Kings chapter 4, who fed 100 people from 20 loaves. And even more so would probably be that emphasis we talked about the place that in the words that Matthew is using here to key our minds into the Hebrew scriptures. He uses the word wilderness, which is going to point to Moses, who fed this newly formed nation of Israel with the bread that the Lord has given you to eat, right? That was manna. That was Exodus chapter 16. I have verse 4 here. I don't know if that's verse 4 or verse 15. Moses, though, is unlike Jesus, because he is not the one who is presented as performing the miracle, right? He's just the spokesman for God. And so the same event here is described in John chapter 6. And I want to read what is there in John chapter 6. This is after the miracle is over. It says, "For the bread of God is that which comes down out of heaven and gives life to the world." Then they said to him, "Lord, always give us this bread." And Jesus said to them, "I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will not hunger, and he who believes in me will never thirst." The bread of life. So we see these figures that are all connected here. We see these figures that are all connected. We see the Exodus from Egypt. They're thinking, we're being fed in the wilderness. We are Israel, and this man is doing it miraculously. This is very much like Moses. There's something important going on here. We have, from our point of view, we see the Last Supper. From our point of view, we see the Messianic banquet, especially Matthew's point of view. But let's transport ourselves back into the story and see some of those nuances that we might be missing. What were the disciples giving away? Think about it. 5 loaves and 2 fish. Even if they were big fish, it wouldn't have fed a bunch of people. Even if they were big loaves, they wouldn't have fed a bunch of people. What were they giving away? What was it? They were giving away everything that they had. They were giving away their only food. But that is the cost, that is the very cost of the kingdom of heaven. It requires you to give away everything, right? Just like the parable of the pearl or the treasure in the field. You have to give up everything, all of your money, to go and take hold of this treasure that's in the field or the pearl. You give everything away, and eventually Jesus begins to rub off on you because you've been following Jesus for long enough, and you begin to care about other people, right? And you bring it to Jesus' attention when you see people suffering, and you pray and you talk to Jesus about it. And Jesus says, yeah, that's a great idea. You do something about it. And we say, no, I've only got this little bit of money here, or I'm too old to connect to the younger generation, or I don't have enough time, or I'm just not trained. I don't know anything good enough to teach it. And Jesus says, perfect. Why don't you just bring that here to me, right? Verse 18. Bring them here to me. Bring them here to me. Because he's going to bless those things. He's going to break them. And miraculously, he's going to make them good enough through himself to multiply, to feed many people. Our small little gift that we can bring. And so, as we move on to the next story, the walking on the water, Jesus' account here of walking on the water is a really spectacular instance of supernatural power, right? And it brings out of us this odd, and it brings out of them, the disciples, a very theologically loaded statement in response from them. In verse 33, let me read that. It says, and those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, you are certainly God's son. It's a very theologically loaded word. We don't have time this morning to get into it, but let's keep going through the story and see what kind of is behind their reaction. Because behind their reaction lies that Old Testament imagery of God walking on or through the sea, right? Job chapter 9 or Psalm 77, or even Isaiah 43 talks about that in Isaiah 43 and verse 16. And so this is a very potent symbol of the creator of the earth and his control over the unruly and chaotic forces of this world. And it's only going to follow naturally then that when Jesus, like God does, walks on the water, the storm is going to yield to his authority. Right? From Jesus praying alone in the hills, the spotlight shifts to his disciples who are in trouble, again, on the lake. And this time, Jesus is Jesus is outside of the boat. This time, Jesus is not in the boat with them to rescue them. So the fourth watch of the night here is from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. How long have they been rowing? How long have they been trying to sail against the wind? Right? These people have been trying for quite a while to get across the lake. It's just not happening. What's the other thing that we should point out here that we might not see because we often kind of glance over it? Jesus is still awake. He's been praying all night. And so Peter has this desire, right? He has this desire to emulate Jesus, to do the same miracle that Jesus is doing. The problem is it's in direct conflict with his experiences as a fisherman, right? He's been a fisherman his whole life. And he knows how to assess risk when he's on the water. So this is an illustration of a vulnerability of the disciple of Jesus who allows doubt, that's you and me, when we allow doubt, which is the natural human perspective, to move out of the way our faith, which relies on the supernatural power of God. Do we remember the loaves? These two stories are connected, right? When the disciples place their faith in Christ and rely on the supernatural power of God to feed the people, they are able to do it themselves. When Peter relies on the supernatural ability of God, he is able to walk on the water. When he relies on his own human perspective and not on his faith, things start to fail. And so Jesus takes Peter's faith and he enters it into that paradox, right, of who he is, who Jesus is. He takes Peter's faith. And even when Peter's faith begins to fail him, Jesus is there to catch him, metaphorically, right? And well, physically, and metaphorically to hand him another basket of fish and bread to hand out. Right? I'm mixing the metaphors here of Jesus walking on the water. But as he's sinking, Jesus catches him and hands him another basket and says, "You go do it." Because there's more work to do in the kingdom. And that really is the lesson for us this morning. So how do all these seemingly disconnected stories come together? I've already kind of made that connection there. But first, we have the tragic death, right, of this leader of the kingdom movement in John the Baptist. And Jesus, he's unable to mourn, and he's filled with compassion for others. And so he continues to communicate to his disciples how the kingdom of God operates and how he would be enthroned as king through a grisly execution, similar to John. Does that sound familiar? Right? It's a mirror image of the Last Supper. Jesus is unable to mourn his own imminent death, and he's still trying to teach his disciples that there's only one way to the kingdom, and that is through him. And here, Jesus in chapter 14 is trying to describe to his disciples that this is not a tragedy at all. John dying is not a tragedy at all. You having not enough food is not a tragedy at all. This is the way it is supposed to be. Yes, there is injustice that has happened in John's death, and there's going to be another great injustice that's going to happen in Jesus' death. And Jesus says that is the way it is supposed to be. It's in the blood and the broken body of Christ where we can paradoxically find the love and the justice of God meeting together in one person. Where Jesus takes God's justice and deals it out, right? He deals it out onto himself. Jesus is taking God's justice on all the terrible and the horrible things, the things that Herod did, the things that you and I will do, the things that all humans perpetrate onto each other, and he puts those consequences onto his own shoulders, the punishment that you and I deserve. And Herod's birthday party is a reflection. I said this several times in the lesson. Herod's birthday party is a reflection of our own heart. Most of us just lack the power and resources to act that terrible, right? Let's not try to pretend that we wouldn't. And so Jesus himself embodies the justice but he also embodies God's love as the symbol of the judge who takes his own judgment onto himself. As he dies on a cross and he absorbs and he carries all the evil and the sin of our actions so that forgiveness can come to really messed up people like you and me. And that's the lesson for this morning from Matthew chapter 14. If you want to respond to that message, if you want to dedicate your life like these people were doing in the feeding of the 5,000 story, of running to Jesus, we can help you with that this morning. Please come and let us know, and we can help you make that commitment. You need to first believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, just like it is in verse 33. That's where it starts. Then you have to repent of your sins, and you have to make a commitment to Christ. If you need help doing any of that this morning, please come forward, and we can help you do that. It's good to have everyone here this morning. We'll look at Matthew chapter 15 next week. This is a really pivotal time in the story here. Jesus will not be going back. Jesus will not be going back to Galilee. And so this is a really pivotal time in the story.